So we continue with this prophecy of Amos. We heard something of the background last week, and I thought perhaps there's just one further element that I think is interesting, in that it's a time of intense prophetic activity. In the south, you've got the prophecy of prophet Isaiah in the court, and then just a bit later, but pretty close to it, the prophecy of Micah, who comes up from the country. There are close parallels between Isaiah and Micah in the kingdom of Judah. And then in the northern kingdom, you've got Hosea in the court, and you've got Amos, who comes out of the country from the country of Judea and up to the head centre in Bethel. So God is doing his best to turn the people back to the right way. So last week we saw the introduction with the various nations around with their 3 transgressions and 4 and so on. And then there was finally the prophecy concerning the people of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, verse 6 of chapter 2, I will not turn this way the punishment thereof. So now we're coming to chapters 3 to 6. Chapter 3 opens, hear this word. And you'll notice you've got the same 3 words, hear this word, at the beginning of chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5. And the Spirit addresses the 3 different people there, because verse 1 of chapter 3 says, hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying. So we've got the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, and that includes Judah. So Judah is involved in this prophecy in chapter 3. Verse 2 says, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. What a great blessing it was that God had known the people of Israel, or the family of Abraham. If we go back to Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, we are in the time of Abraham, and God is about to bring judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot, Abraham's nephew, is in Sodom, and God wants to, and Abraham wants to save them. But before that, God says in Genesis chapter 18, verse 17 says, and the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, for I know him. You only have I known. I know him, that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and judgment, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he hath spoken of him. So the descendants of Abraham, through Isaac and then through Jacob, were the ones that the whole family that God has known. It was a great blessing to them that God had known, that they were the only family that he knew in the sense of calling themselves unto him. And so therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities, it says in verse 2. The word for punish is visit upon, to visit, and it comes in various places. The idea is to visit. If we go to in the end of Genesis, in the 50th chapter, when Joseph makes commandment concerning his bones, he says that God will surely visit you and bring you out of the land of Egypt. And so God visiting can be a blessing or it can be a punishment. In the case of Joseph and the family, it was a blessing that God visited the people of Israel and delivered them from the land of Egypt. Here, God was going to visit upon them for all their iniquities. So it was going to bring punishment. So God will visit his people, dealing with them as they have responded to his word. Verse 3 says, can two walk together except they be agreed? And it's wonderful to think of Noah, who is said to have walked with God, as before him Enoch. Of Enoch it is said that he walked with God. Can two walk together except they be agreed? And God wants his people to walk with him. And that's the way that we should be. We should be walking in his way, walking with him. So here is what a terrific blessing it is that we have been blessed in knowing him and the invitation to walk with him. He goes on to say, will a lion roar in the forest with no prey, or a bird fall into a snare upon the earth? Verse 5. Or verse 6, shall a trumpet be blown in the city and the people not be afraid? But then, shall there be evil in a city, and the Lord Yahweh hath not done it? God brings evil as a punishment for sin. And if there is evil in a city, then God will have put it there. And so that's there as a punishment for sin. We've been given an exalted position, but it brings responsibility. The nation of Israel, particularly, had been placed in that position. Verse 7, just think of this. Surely the Lord Yahweh will do nothing, but he revealeth his secret unto his servants, the prophets. Nobody in the world, apart from the people of God, have been told the secret of God, what is going to happen. And what a blessing it is for us, brethren and sisters, that we know beforehand that soon the kingdom of God is going to be established. And where there is despair all around us, we know that God is in control. What a great blessing it is that we know him and that he has invited us to join with him. It's an immense privilege to have this information and this care from God. Verse 8 says, publish in the palaces at Ashdod and in the palaces of the land of Egypt, and say, assemble yourselves upon the mountains of Samaria. So there were going to be enemies from Ashdod, the Philistines, and from the land of Egypt, the Egyptians. and they were going to assemble themselves upon the mountains of Samaria. There was going to be an invasion. Behold, the great tumults in the midst thereof, and the oppressed in the midst thereof. So the people of Israel were going to be oppressed by the invaders who were going to come because of their iniquity. If we go on to verse 12, it says there, thus saith the Lord, thus saith Yahweh. And that's the introduction to each of the prophecies in the first and second chapters. Chapter 2, verse 1, for instance, thus saith Yahweh for 3 transgressions of Moab, and so on. Verse 4, thus saith Yahweh for 3 transgressions of Judah, and thus saith Yahweh, verse 6, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4. So here is the pronouncement of Yahweh. Verse 12 continues, as the shepherd taketh out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or the piece of an ear, so shall the children of Israel be taken out that dwell in Samaria, in the corner of a bed, and in Damascus in a couch. So, as a shepherd taketh out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or the piece of an ear. It's interesting that a later prophecy, the prophecy of Jeremiah, and chapter 50, speaks in very similar terms. Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 17 says, Israel is a scattered sheep. The judgment had already come upon them, and they were scattered. The lions have driven him away. Just notice scattered sheep. And it's as it were, as a shepherd taketh out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear. We're in the same area. It's a sheep that has been ravaged by an invading lion. The lions have driven, back in Jeremiah 50 verse 17, Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First, the king of Assyria hath devoured him, and last, this Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones. So the northern kingdom of Israel was invaded by the Assyrians and taken into captivity by them. The Babylonians took the kingdom of Judah into captivity. So by the time of the prophecy of Jeremiah, then this prophecy had been fulfilled. And the remnant, those that managed to escape, there were just bits, 2 legs or the piece of an ear, as it were, parts of the sheep. And it'll be the people dwelling in Samaria, just a few will get away, will not be taken away. And see, in Damascus, I think that it's not talking about the place of Damascus, it's talking about being under the cover of damask. It's a material that was produced in Damascus, in a covering, in a couch, as it were. So there was going to be an invasion, and few were going to get away. Verse 13, hear ye and testify in the house of Jacob, saith the Lord Yahweh, the God of hosts, that in that day that I shall visit the transgressions of Israel upon him, I will also visit the altars of Bethel. So, first of all then, testify in the house of Jacob, so that covers the whole family, in verse 13, and then verse 14, it says, I will visit the transgressions. Again, the word for visit, punish, used earlier in the chapter. I will visit the transgressions of Israel upon him. I will also visit the altars of Bethel. And the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. Bethel then was the centre of the false worship of the northern kingdom of Israel. If we go to the prophecy, in the first book of Kings and chapter 12, we come to the start of this setting up of Bethel as a false centre of false worship. First of Kings chapter 12, Jeroboam has just been given 10 tribes, and Rehoboam had kept 2, Judah and Benjamin. And Jeroboam is frightened that if the people go to Jerusalem, then they'll forsake him. So, verse 28 of 1 Kings chapter 12 says, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And he set the one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. So he claims that these are the gods that have brought them out of the land of Egypt. And so you've got a completely false system of worship with the 2 calves, golden calves, one calf in Bethel and the other in Dan, at the southern end and the northern end of the northern kingdom of Israel. Just notice that he says, these are the gods which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. At the start of this chapter, in Amos chapter 3, God says, verse 1, O children of Israel, God hath spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying. So you've got rival systems of worship and rival claims to have delivered the people from the land of Egypt. Now, behind this, there's a background. You've got the conflict between Judah and Ephraim. If we go back to Genesis chapter 37, we have the situation where Joseph is sold by his brethren. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 26, we read that Judah said unto his brethren, what profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. So Judah was the prime mover in selling Joseph into Egypt. So that's the character of Judah in Genesis chapter 37. In chapter 38, we have a chapter about Judah. And as part of this, Judah is shown that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, was more righteous than he was. The circumstances were that she gave birth to 2 sons, which were sons of Judah. And in chapter 38 and verse 26, we read that Judah acknowledged the tokens that he'd given this, what he thought was a harlot, and he said, "She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more." So Judah acknowledged, "She hath been more righteous than I." And that produces a change in Judah. That change is shown particularly when they go down into Egypt on the second time, when Benjamin has gone down into Egypt, and Joseph has found, or the cup of Joseph has been found with Benjamin, and Benjamin is going to be brought into captivity in Egypt. Well, here we have in chapter 44 of Genesis one of those most moving statements in that book. If you go to, as part of that, Judah pleads for Benjamin. And he says, verse 32, "For thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, If I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let thy servant abide instead of the lad a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren." So we've got a change of heart. He's sold Joseph. He doesn't realise that he's talking to Joseph, but he pleads for Benjamin and offers to go as a bond slave to Joseph instead of Benjamin. And then in chapter 48, we have the blessing by Jacob of the two sons of Joseph. The elder was Manasseh, and the younger was Ephraim. And Jacob puts his right hand on Ephraim's head, and Joseph tries to move his hand. But in chapter 48 and verse 19, we read, "And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also," that's Manasseh, "shall become a people, and he also shall be great. But truly his younger brother, Ephraim, shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude," or a fullness of nations. That'll come up again a bit later on. So Ephraim was to be greater than Manasseh. And then we come into chapter 49, and the blessings on the sons of Jacob, and the blessing on Judah includes verse 10, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be." A rivalry between the greater son of Joseph, Ephraim, and Judah. And it was Judah that was going to be the ruler in the end. There's even a further element of this controversy, in that the first place of worship was in Shiloh, which is in the territory of Ephraim. But then the centre of worship was moved to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, or on the border between Judah and Benjamin. So we see the conflict between the two, Judah and Ephraim. And this was now a conflict between Bethel and Jerusalem. Right, back to the prophecy of Amos then, and chapter 4. Verse 1, hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring and let us drink. So this is addressed to the cows from Bashan who are in the mountain of Samaria. So we're addressing the northern kingdom of Israel, headed by Ephraim. It says they oppress the poor and crush the needy. So that's a cruel regime up in the northern kingdom of Israel. In chapter 2 and verse 6, one of the transgressions of Israel was, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he sold the righteous for silver and the poor for a pair of shoes. The oppression of the poor was one of the sins of the northern kingdom of Israel. There's an interesting contrast in the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, where the wife, the diligent wife, is commended for the things that she does. And this is a godly woman then. Proverbs chapter 30 and verse 20 says that she stretcheth out her hand to the poor, yea, she reacheth forth her hands to the needy. Godly people are kind to the poor and look after them. Ungodly people oppress the poor. And this is shown in this contrast between Judah and Ephraim, or at least that's the condemnation of Ephraim was the oppression of the poor. And so verse 2 of Amos chapter 4, the Lord Yahweh hath sworn by his holiness that, lo, the days come upon you, that he will take you away with hooks and your posterity with fish hooks. So they were going to be taken away. He hath sworn the day has come that he will take you away. Your posterity is the remnant that were left. There were first the bulk, and then the individuals were going to be taken away into captivity. And he goes on in verse 4, come ye to Bethel and transgress. So we've already heard about Bethel. At Gilgal, multiply transgression. What has Gilgal to do with transgression? Well, if we go back to Judges chapter 3, we find there a mention of Gilgal in connection with idolatry. The Judges chapter 3, we've got the Ehud and his conflict with Eglon, that very fat man. And we read in verse 19 of Judges chapter 3, this is the Ehud. He turned again from the quarries that were by Gilgal and said, I have a secret errand unto thee. Now that word quarries, the margin says graven images. The word for quarry is the same as the graven image, but you can see it cutting rock out of a rock face is pretty similar to cutting the shape of a person out of a rock. So graven images and quarries, they're the same word in the Hebrew. And verse 26 says, Ehud escaped while they tarried and passed beyond the quarries, the graven images, and escaped unto Serath. So in verse 19, it was they were by Gilgal. And it seems that idolatry was picked up again in the time that Amos is prophesying. It had been done. There was idolatry associated with the graven images at Gilgal at this time. So verse 5 of Amos chapter 4, they offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving with leaven and proclaim and publish the free offerings. This liketh you, O ye children of Israel, saith the Lord Yahweh. They offer, or the margin says, offer by burning. It is that particular type of offering is a burning offering with leaven. Now, in Leviticus chapter 7, they could offer leaven with the sacrifice of thanksgiving, but that word for offer isn't this word for burning, it's a word for approach. And in Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 11, there is a direct prohibition of burning leaven in association with their worship. Leviticus chapter 2 and at verse 11 we read, No meal offering which ye shall bring unto Yahweh shall be made with leaven, for ye shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering of Yahweh made by fire. As for the oblation of the first fruits, ye shall offer them unto Yahweh, but they shall not be burnt on the altar for a sweet savour. So there was a prohibition that they were ignoring in the northern kingdom. They had that system of worship. They got a system of worship associated with the golden calf in Bethel. But it was a false system of worship. It was a perversion of the way that of worshipping the true God. So verse 6 goes on to say, I also have given you cleanliness of teeth, the cleanness of teeth in all your cities. It's not an advert for Colgate. The cleanness of teeth meant they hadn't gotten much food. And then, but yet have ye not returned unto me. And you've got a series of punishments. I've withholden rain, verse 7. Verse 9, I've smitten you with blasting and mildew. Verse 10, I've sent among you the pestilence. And verse 11, I've overthrown some of you, as God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith Yahweh. He's brought punishments to bring them back, but they've not turned to him. And so, verse 12, therefore thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. For he that formeth the mountains, and createth the wind, and declareth unto man what is his thought. And constantly there's reference back to the creation, to Genesis, to the early history of the people of Israel in this prophecy. There's a reference to creation there. that it's God that is the one who is the great creator and is going to deal with them. And so chapter 5 opens with the same words, "Hear ye this word which I take up against you, even a lamentation, O house of Israel." So this is the northern kingdom particularly now that is being addressed. And so there's a lamentation for the house of Israel. Verse 4, although the punishment is going to come upon them, verse 3 says, "A city that went out by 1,000 shall leave 100, and that which went out by 100 shall leave 10 to the house of Israel." So they were going to be defeated in battle. But see the remarkable nature of this prophecy. He says, yes, punishment's going to come upon you, but you don't have to. Verse 4, "For thus saith Yahweh unto the house of Israel, seek ye me, and ye shall live." God wants them to turn back, and he exhorts them to turn back. Verse 5, "But seek not Bethel, nor enter into Gilgal, and pass not to Beersheba." Beersheba? How was that a centre of idolatry? And that's right in the south, beyond the kingdom of Judah. I've always thought that. But if you go to Joshua chapter 19 and verse 2, we find there that the allocation of the parts of the land, chapter 18 of Joshua, chapter 19 and verse 2 says, verse 1 says, "The second lot came forth to Simeon," and verse 2 says, "And they had in their inheritance Beersheba and Sheba and Moladah." So Beersheba was part of the inheritance of Simeon. It was part of the 10-tribed kingdom in the north, although it was further south than most of the kingdom of Judah. But they had set up a system of false worship in Beersheba, probably associated with the memory of Isaac in that area, because that was the centre of Isaac's activity in the book of Genesis. Anyway, it looks as though there was some false worship in Beersheba, which was part of the northern kingdom. Okay, back in Amos chapter 5 and verse 6, we read, "Seek Yahweh, and ye shall live." So there's the exhortation, come back, seek him, and ye shall live, lest you break out like fire. And that's an interesting part of the structure of Amos. If you go to the first and second chapters, if you look at each of the punishments, you've got verse 7, "I'll send a fire on the wall of Gaza." Verse 10, "I'll send a fire on this chapter 1. Verse 10 of chapter 1, "I'll send a fire on the wall of Tyrus." Verse 12, "I'll send a fire upon Teman and kindle a fire." Verse 14, "on the wall of Rabbah." I'll send a fire, verse 2 of chapter 2, upon Moab. And then I will send a fire upon Judah in verse 5 of chapter 2. But there's no, I will send a fire on Israel. And it's not until this 5th chapter that we have that prophecy, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph. So it's here that we get the fire being brought upon the house of Joseph. So Joseph is the centre, and of course it's Ephraim, the son of Joseph, that was the leading tribe in the northern kingdom. Verse 7 says, "Ye who turn judgment to wormwood and leave off righteousness in the earth." Wormwood, a bitter wood. In chapter 6 and verse 12, we read, "Shall horses run upon the rock? Shall one plough there with oxen? For ye have turned judgment into gall, and the fruit of righteousness into hemlock." And that word hemlock is a translation of the same as as wormwood. Now these are references back to the law. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 29 and see how God through Moses gives the children of Israel their position and a note of their privileged position in Deuteronomy chapter 29. Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 10. "You stand this day, all of you, before Yahweh your God." So they're all the people of Israel. Verse 12, "that thou shouldest enter into a covenant with Yahweh thy God, and into this oath which Yahweh thy God maketh thee this day." Verse 13, "that he may establish thee today for a people unto himself, that he may be to thee a God. And he's not the God of the dead, but of the living." It's a great privilege that the people of Israel had, that God had appeared unto them. Verse 17, talking about Egypt, where they've come from, "Ye have seen their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them. Lest there should be among you man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turneth away this day from Yahweh our God to go and serve the gods of the nations, lest there should be among you a root that beareth gall and wormwood." And that's what's happened to this northern kingdom of Israel. They've turned away from him and they're serving the gods of the nations around them. God pleads with them. Well, verse 8 of Amos chapter 5, "Seek him that maketh the 7 stars and Orion." Pleiades is the name given to the 7 stars. It's mentioned in the book of Job. God is the maker of the 7 stars. Another reference to the creation. We saw formeth and createth in verse 13 of chapter 4. Now he says he maketh. He made the stars also, it says in Genesis chapter 1. He maketh the 7 stars and Orion. God is the creator. Don't bow down to them. And then he says, he seeketh him that maketh the 7 stars and Orion, that turneth the shadow of death into the morning. God can save from out of death. The shadow of death occurs most in the book of Job, 10 times there. In the Psalms 4 times, Isaiah once and Jeremiah twice, and just this last one in the prophecy of Amos. God can overcome the shadow of death and bring salvation. So, verse 9 says, God strengtheneth the spoiled against the strong. He can support those that trust in him. They hate him that rebuketh in the gate. That's the character of the people in this kingdom of Israel. And so on. So there's a condemnation of this people because they have turned away from him. And there's so much more there, and the judgments were going to come upon them. Time's moving on. So I'll just pick up the last 3 verses of chapter 5. Have ye offered unto me sacrifice and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? You've borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and so on. If you go to the 7th chapter of the book of Acts, Acts chapter 7, you see Stephen quoting this verse and changing it slightly, and which gives us the interpretation of it. Acts chapter 7 and verse 42. Stephen, in his speech, says, Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets. O ye house of Israel, have ye offered to me slain beasts and sacrifices by the space of 40 years in the wilderness? Yea, ye took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, figures which ye made to worship them, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So not just beyond Damascus, as in the prophecy of Amos, but beyond Babylon, as he said, as Stephen says. Remphan and Chion are different words for the same idol related to to Saturn. They worship the stars of the heavens. So they were to be taken into captivity. Chapter 6, verse 1, Woe to them that are at ease in Zion. The southern kingdom as well. And trust in the mountain of Samaria, which are named chief of the nations, to whom the house of Israel came. So we come back. The kingdom of Judah isn't without sin. The concentration is on the northern kingdom. It says, pass unto Calneh. Calneh was on the river Tigris. It was set up originally by Nimrod in the book of Genesis. And go to Hamath the Great, and then down to Gath, the Philistines. Are any of those places better than the kingdom that you have been given? And no, they're not. God has given them a good land, and they have got a time of prosperity. Verse 4, they lie upon beds of ivory and stretch themselves upon their couches, eat the lambs out of the flock and the calves out of the midst of the stall. So they've got this prosperity that's been given to them. Verse 6 says, they drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves with the chief ointments, but they are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. You go back to the history of Joseph. And while Joseph was put in the pit, his brethren ate and enjoyed themselves, and then sold him to the Ishmaelites. So they're not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. Genesis 37 verse 25 shows what they did. Verse 8, The Lord Yahweh has sworn by himself, saith Yahweh, the God of hosts, I abhor the excellency of Jacob and hate his palaces. Therefore I will deliver up the city with all that is therein, and it's the fullness thereof. It's that same thing that was going to be, that Ephraim was going to be exalted into in Genesis chapter 48 and verse 19. So this blessing on Ephraim is God hates, and he's going to deliver the city, and they were going to be taken into captivity. So there'll be a lot of bloodshed and so on. Verse 12 says, shall horses run upon the rock, the high, inaccessible rock, the Selah is the word for rock. And no, you can't do that. You've turned judgment into gall and the fruit of righteousness into hemlock. And so judgment was going to be brought upon them. Ye rejoice in a thing of naught. Their idols were nothing. What they were worshipping were non-existent. And so verse 14, behold, I'll raise up against you a nation, O house of Israel, saith Yahweh, the God of hosts, and they shall afflict you from the entering in of Hamath unto the river of the wilderness. And so they're going to be brought down and taken into captivity. Now, if we go to the 2nd of Kings and chapter 14, we find there that same area that's been mentioned in the prophecy of Amos. 2nd of Kings chapter 14 and verse 23. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria. And it's in the reign of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, that Amos is prophesying. He did that which was evil. And verse 25, he restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath unto the sea of the plain. The sea, well, that would be the Dead Sea, the Sea of the Arabah, the Wadi of the Arabah. It mentions in the last verse of Amos chapter 6. So just look at what it says. He restored the coast from the entering of Hamath to the sea of the plain, according to the word of Yahweh, God of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher. For Yahweh saw the affliction of Israel, and it was very bitter, for there was not any shut up nor left, nor any helper for Israel. God had pity for the people of Israel in the time of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And it's at this time that Amos prophesies. They've had respite from all the trouble that have been brought upon them because of their sins. But they had not turned to him. They had just enjoyed their luxury. And so God was going to bring a nation against them and take them into captivity. And chapter 7 goes on to show visions that speak of the punishment that was going to come upon them. What a wonderful God we're dealing with, brothers and sisters. How that with all their sins, with the punishment that was going to come upon them, there was a plea continually for them to come back. And we, brothers and sisters, if we go astray, let us see that we come back, that we realise the privileged position that we are in, so that we may put our trust in him, we may serve him faithfully and walk in his ways, that we may be able to say that we walk with God as Noah and Enoch did so long ago, so that when the kingdom is established, we may be accounted worthy to join in that kingdom.